Is the Bank of Canada losing control of inflation? Did they even have control of inflation to begin with? Well, we've got the new CPI numbers, which show rent inflation at the highest level since 42 years. That is after the Bank of Canada cut interest rates just this month. So what does that say about their credibility? And we've been talking about a lot of this stuff, which we're going to go through. We got like so many data points and charts, so please stay to the end of this video. Very important data packed video. Canada's inflation surprises higher in May, casting doubt on a July rate cut. Canada's annual inflation rate re-accelerated unexpectedly to 2.9% in May, while measures of core inflation also increased, according to Statistics Canada, reducing the odds of the Bank of Canada rate cut in July. We don't really care about that on this channel. They're token rate cuts at this point that are going to take 12 to 18 months to even be realized in the economy. But what is so interesting is what they put here and how they don't highlight even that rent inflation is at the highest level in 42 years, which we're going to get into shortly. So analysts had expected inflation to cool to 2.6% from 2.7% in April, according to Reuters. Statistics Canada said on Tuesday that acceleration was largely due to the prices for services, which increased 4.6% in May after a 4.2% increase in April. The services price growth was led by cellular services, travel, tours, rent, and air transportation. So they shine the light on services, but they don't really shine the light too much on the rent inflation there. The Bank of Canada's closely watched measures of core inflation, and we'll get into the charts in just a second. Also edged up in May, surprising economists. CPI median increased from 2.6% to 2.8% in May, while CPI trim was up from 2.8% in April to 2.9% in May. Economists expected CPI median to be around 2.6%, or CPI as we call it. But the interesting thing is we're going to get into these charts now. So the inflation rate came in. We're at this 2.9%, same as we were at in March. But as I've said, the year-over-year numbers are not really the thing that we've been closely looking at on this channel over the past couple of months. It's really been what's been happening with the month-over-month numbers, which we're going to look at right now. So this is the month-over-month acceleration in the CPI. I call it the CPI because it's not accurate. We'll get into that at the end, where I'll show you some data from the 1980s that will blow your mind on how inflation is measured. So anyway, if you look at what's happened over this year, we printed 0 in January, then 0.3%, then March 2024, 0.6%, April 0.5%, May 0.6%. So we're in June right now, guys. We just had the May report, so we got 5 months report of the CPI, and the CPI inflation cumulatively this year, God, that's a mouthful, is actually higher than the Bank of Canada's inflation target. So what does that say about them? It's going to be very interesting to see how the markets perceive this, especially the currency markets, because some would argue that the currency is going to strengthen against the US dollar because they're going to be anticipating less rate cuts coming into the future. But others could also say, well, it also says that the Bank of Canada doesn't have a clue what they're doing. They've constantly reiterated the message that inflation is their top priority and it's only inflation that matters. And we're looking at this data, as I've pointed out many, many times, and it makes zero sense if you're the Bank of Canada going by their broken metrics, why they would be cutting rates. Now, I'm not saying that that doesn't mean that they should be cutting rates. I'm saying that if you went by their metrics, they shouldn't be cutting rates. So what does that tell you about the underlying fundamentals of the economy? What's happening with the mortgage market? We know there are several things that are going to come into play here, especially when it comes to the housing market, which is just imploding right now. Under the surface, all these dodgy mortgages, as we've discussed many times, and I'd highly recommend that you check out the interview with John Flynn, the full interview that I'll link at the end of this. Less than 1% of the people that watched the preview on Sunday actually watched the full interview, and there was so many great details that John came in with in that interview. I'd highly recommend you watch it. I will link it on the end screens of of this video. So anyway, what's happening with inflation here is not really good, is it? When you've got cumulative inflation for the year already surpassing the Bank of Canada's 2% target. You look at core inflation, which excludes all the core things we actually want and need, and it's at 1.8%, and that's year over year, but that has even accelerated drastically. So when you look at the month over month numbers, you take the base effects out of the equation by just looking at the month over month numbers, you can see how they're really starting to accelerate here. And obviously the Canadian dollar has weakened significantly. April was the low for 2024. And is this now what is bleeding into the numbers that are coming forward for May? Because obviously it has a slight lag effect, but then things like food inflation adjust pretty rapidly to that because the oligarchies, there's no competition in Canada. So they immediately just amend all their prices. And there are so many things that Canadians rely on, like food, that they can't afford anyway. As we covered last week, food banks are on the brink of collapse in this depression. Could that be a major problem? And we're going to get into even the government in their numbers. They're highlighting what's going on here, and it's not good. In fact, let me show you this. So largest month over month increase in grocery prices since January 2023. So this was included in the CPI report that came out today. And you can see that, yes, since January 2023, so a long time, we've got the largest month over month increase in grocery prices. Now, what's really interesting is inflation and the year over year numbers. You think 2.4%. Yes, it went up from 2.3%, but it doesn't look that bad. But then you actually go to the government's numbers and you dig into the nuance, and it's like, hold on, what the hell is going on here? And the mainstream media, you hear crickets from them about this. You hear crickets from them about the rent inflation. You hear crickets from them about the grocery prices. Is that because Loblaws and all these other oligarchy partners are all funding the mainstream media? Possibly. I mean, that is definitely going to weigh on what they publish in the media for sure. But another thing is the mass migration program, which we're going to get onto, because that is obvious, the correlation between rents and mass migration. So we're going to get into that shortly. Let's just finish going through what's going on here. So rent inflation, I wanted to show you this chart. It's just mind-boggling. So you're at 8.9% in May. You went down a little bit and now we're going back up. I said that nothing goes up or down in a straight line, and we're just continually going higher. This is the highest since 1982, guys. So this is a long, over 42 years. Over 42 years we haven't seen rent inflation this high. It is just unbelievable and crazy that you just had a Bank of Canada come in and cut rates. I just oh my God, like their credibility is just completely down the toilet. And it is because of the Ponzi economy that has been created in Canada around the housing and mortgage market. But it cannot sustain and is imploding. The central planners are just hoping that they can pull the strings and control everything. But they really can't, unfortunately. When a bubble gets this large, it gets even larger than their powers. So anyway, let's continue on here. So the food inflation, like I said, 2.4%. You look at services inflation. This is the highest that we've had in a while. So you saw service inflation for the past year pretty much flat, not really doing a lot, and it's started to tick up. This is the highest that we've seen since April 2023. So over a year. So again, it's not looking very good there. And then this is where the prices went up in different components. So you've got food that was on the way up. You've got shelter that was on the way up. You've got household operations, furnishings and equipment down, clothing and footwear down. Transportation is up. Health and personal care is up. Recreation, education and reading up slightly. Alcohol, beverages, tobacco products and recreational cannabis also up. So it's very interesting what's going on there. The core things that people actually need that the Bank of Canada excludes from their core numbers are actually increasing at a rapid pace. Things like groceries grocery prices. We've already been through this so many times that people cannot afford food in the depression that is unfolding in Canada. Mostly right now, the depression is affecting those new immigrants that are coming into Canada and poorer Canadians. But don't be naive. It's going to bleed through and everybody will be affected by this, unfortunately. So anyway, I want to show you how this correlates now with the mass migration program. So if you look at what's happened with the population in Canada, and this is old, we just had the number last week that came out, absolutely crazy. This is just completely nuts considering where productivity is, considering how bad the labor market is already, considering how bad poverty is already increasing in Canada, and you're just importing more people that are going into this depression. It's almost like it was planned and orchestrated, but I'll leave you to be the judge on that. So anyway, what I want to show you is if you look right here on this chart, during 2020 and 2021, we had immigration and the population which just flattened out. It just completely stalled at 38 million, as you can see. So 2020 and 2021. So now if we go back to the rent inflation chart, guess what happened in 2020 and 2021? Well, rent inflation actually went down the most that you'd ever seen it going back pretty much to the 1960s. We never saw rent inflation slow that much. I mean, it nearly actually went negative here in 2021, February 2021. It was just barely positive. And just imagine what would have happened if the population had not started increasing rapidly again. Again, we've been through the correlation with this. It has no correlation with things like mortgage rates, like the mainstream media is trying to tell you, oh, your rents are going up because mortgage rates are going up. I swear it's the banks that are funding those type of articles. But the mainstream media is trying to tell you, oh yeah, it's just because interest rates have gone up that rents are going up and it has this lag. That's not true at all. The rental market is supply and demand. And if you've got tons of people that are coming in and none of them can afford to buy a place, it's marginal the amount of people that can afford to buy a place in Canada, so marginal that it wouldn't even impact the housing market, as I've discussed many times. But most of those people are going to rent. And again, if you can pack more people into a rental and the average household size is increasing as well, but you can pack more people into a rental, that means you can charge more money, and that means the rent inflation just increases and increasing. And as me and John Flynn discussed in that interview, which once again I will link at the end of this, please go there and watch it and be part of the 1% that does after watching this video. But the interesting thing about that whole situation is, as John has talked about in the past, there are millions of basement suites, both legal and illegal, that aren't even included in the total rental and housing stock in the numbers that we see. So you often see these numbers, oh, Canada is building the least amount of homes per person, blah, blah, blah. It's so bad. We just need to build, and everything's going to be okay. But that's not actually the case. There's a ton of shadow supply that is out there. And I just cannot imagine, I've been trying to think this through, what's going to happen when the Conservatives get in charge, because if they do actually limit immigration, well, rents are going to absolutely tank. What's that going to do to the housing market? And what's that going to do to their build plan, which is basically to try and boost the economy through reliance more on construction and building, even though over 40% of the Ponzi economy in Canada is already just on people trading houses, trading real estate. That is literally it. 40% of GDP. It is just mind-boggling. And you wonder why productivity is absolutely tanking through the floor. And then one final thing that you must know, and many of you have seen this before, is shadow stats. So shadow stats inflation, they published this 1980s chart, and I've linked everything that I've been through in this video, including that Wall Street article, which is very interesting to read, in the description. But if you look at this, so this is the 1980s base CPI. You can see the US CPI-U there, very similar to the Canada one, which is under 5%. Meanwhile, if you measured it like the 1980s base CPI, you would be right now between 10 and 15%. And that is more like the numbers that you and I know are more truthful real in what inflation is really at, not these CPI numbers that we're being fed by the central planners and the government. And it is just absolutely crazy because they're unable to even contain those numbers. So anyway, if you've enjoyed this video, go and watch this video and subscribe to the podcast channel. Very, very great discussion we had there. Lots of insights. And if you're looking for a VPN to protect your privacy against government overreach, go to expressvpn.com/marketmania. I will see you in the next one. Take care, guys.